The last time my father looked me in the eyes, he told the man I loved to marry someone else. The next time I saw him, he was standing at my front gate asking for forgiveness. I watched the security monitor without moving. 3 figures stood beyond the wrought iron gate leading to my home. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the stone driveway, making them appear older than I remembered. Perhaps they were. Time has a way of carving truth into people's faces. My father, Richard Morgan, stood in the center, shoulders no longer straight with the confidence that had once filled every room he entered. Beside him was Ethan Brooks, the man who had once slipped an engagement ring onto my finger and promised we would grow old together. He kept his hands folded in front of him, avoiding the security camera as if refusing to meet my eyes even through a lens. For a brief moment, I almost didn't recognize him. The years had softened neither his features nor my memories. There was no anger rising inside me. That surprised me. If someone had told the 28-year-old version of Claire Morgan that one day these 2 men would appear outside her home asking to see her, she would have imagined herself slamming the gate in their faces or demanding answers that had haunted her for years. Instead, at 36, I simply stood there holding a cup of tea that had already gone cold. My assistant's voice came softly through the office doorway. "Claire, there's someone at the front entrance." "I know." She hesitated. Should I ask security to send them away? I looked once more at the monitor. My father had removed his hat. He was waiting, not demanding, waiting. That alone told me more than words ever could. "Give me a few minutes," I replied quietly. She nodded and disappeared. Silence settled across the room. The house around me reflected a life I had built one careful decision at a time. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked landscaped gardens. Shelves displayed architectural awards gathered over the last decade. Framed sketches from projects completed across several states lined the hallway leading toward my office. None of it had existed when I left home. Back then, all I owned fit inside 2 suitcases. People often assume success arrives with one extraordinary opportunity. It doesn't. Sometimes it arrives disguised as the worst day of your life. I set my tea on the desk and walked toward the window overlooking the front garden. Richard shifted his weight uncomfortably. Ethan glanced toward the driveway before lowering his head again. Neither man pressed the intercom. Neither appeared impatient, almost as though they believed they had already lost the right to ask for anything. For years, I wondered whether either of them ever thought about what happened that afternoon, whether my father ever replayed his own words, whether Ethan remembered the expression on my face, whether either of them understood that betrayal doesn't always destroy a person. Sometimes it introduces them to someone stronger. My phone buzzed softly. A calendar reminder appeared across the screen. Board meeting. 30 minutes. Ordinarily, I never allowed personal matters to interfere with work. Today was different. Not because I feared seeing them, because I had never expected life to circle back quite like this. I took a slow breath. The strange thing about healing is that it happens quietly. There is no single morning when you wake up completely free from pain. One day you simply realize the memories no longer control your heartbeat. Standing there, looking through reinforced glass at the 2 people who had once changed the course of my entire life, I discovered something unexpected. I didn't want revenge. I didn't even want an apology. Those had belonged to the woman I used to be. The woman standing in this house wanted only one thing: to protect the peace she had spent 8 long years creating. I picked up my keys, not because I had already decided to forgive them, but because every story deserves to end with the truth. And ours had never truly ended on the day my father told my fiancé to marry my best friend. 8 years earlier, I believed my life had finally settled into the shape I had always imagined. I was 28 years old, recently promoted to senior architect at a respected design firm in Boston, engaged to a man I had loved for 4 years, and counting the days until our wedding. If someone had asked me then what success looked like, I wouldn't have mentioned money. I would have described Sunday dinners at my father's house, my fiancé laughing across the table, my best friend helping me choose flowers, the feeling that I belonged somewhere. Looking back now, I realize how carefully people can protect an illusion. My father, Richard Morgan, had raised me alone after my mother passed away when I was 12. He wasn't affectionate in the traditional sense. Praise was rare, hugs even rarer. Instead, he believed providing opportunities was his version of love. He paid for college. He taught me discipline. He reminded me constantly that respect had to be earned. As a child, I accepted that without question. As an adult, I still wanted one thing more than any promotion or paycheck: his approval. Ethan Brooks entered my life during my final year at graduate school. He was intelligent, confident without appearing arrogant, and possessed the kind of effortless charm that made conversations feel easy. Our relationship never exploded into dramatic romance. It grew quietly. Study sessions became dinners. Dinners became weekends together. Weekends became plans for forever. When he proposed beside the Charles River on a chilly October evening, I never doubted my answer. Yes. It felt like the simplest decision I'd ever made. Natalie Carter had been my closest friend since college. She was outgoing where I was reserved, spontaneous where I preferred planning. She could walk into a room filled with strangers and leave knowing everyone's name. I admired that about her. She often joked that she was the social half of our friendship while I handled the practical side. It worked. At least, I believed it did. When I asked her to be my maid of honor, she cried before I did. "You know I'm going to make sure your wedding is perfect," she promised. I know. And I meant it. Wedding planning consumed nearly every weekend. Cake tastings, venue visits, guest lists, dress fittings, the ordinary chaos every engaged couple experiences. Whenever work became overwhelming, Natalie volunteered to meet vendors on my behalf. Whenever Ethan was busy, she reassured me everything remained on schedule. Looking back, trust rarely disappears overnight. It erodes so slowly that you mistake each warning sign for ordinary life. My father surprised me more than once during those months. He seemed unusually interested in Natalie. "She has remarkable confidence," he commented after one family dinner. "She does. She carries herself well." I smiled. "She always has." Then he'd glance toward me with an expression I couldn't quite understand. "You've always been too quiet, Claire." It wasn't criticism exactly, but it never felt like encouragement either. I laughed it off. I'd spent my entire life hearing variations of the same observation. Too serious, too practical, too focused on work, too reserved. Ethan usually defended me. "I like that she's steady," he'd say. Richard would simply nod, as though accepting an opinion he didn't entirely share. The guest list eventually reached 142 people. Our venue overlooked the Atlantic coastline just north of Boston. Every contract had been signed, every invitation mailed, every hotel room reserved. Friends often asked whether I felt nervous. I always answered honestly. No, I wasn't nervous. I was grateful. Grateful for the career I'd built. Grateful for the family I believed supported me. Grateful for the man waiting at the end of the aisle. If life teaches anything, it's that certainty is often quietest immediately before it disappears. 3 days before the wedding, Natalie insisted we have one final girls' night together. No wedding talk. She laughed as she handed me a glass of sparkling water. Just us. We sat on the balcony of my apartment overlooking the city lights. She smiled often that evening. Too often. I mistook it for excitement. Now I recognize something entirely different. Sometimes people smile because they're celebrating. Sometimes they smile because they're hiding the truth. I had no idea which one it was. But in only a few days, my father would say a single sentence that would destroy every future I believed had already been written. People often ask whether a single moment can change an entire life. The answer is yes. Sometimes it takes less than a sentence. The morning of my wedding arrived with the kind of flawless weather every bride secretly hopes for. The Atlantic shimmered beneath a cloudless sky, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of salt water through the open windows of the bridal suite. Everything looked exactly as I had imagined. White roses filled every corner of the room. My wedding dress hung beside the window, catching the morning light. Bridesmaids laughed in the hallway while photographers moved quietly from room to room, documenting what everyone believed would become a perfect beginning. Natalie sat beside me while the makeup artist adjusted the final touches. "You're unusually calm," she said with a smile. "I've been calm this whole engagement." "You're really not nervous?" I laughed softly. "I already know the man I'm marrying." She reached for my hand. "He's lucky." Looking back, I sometimes wonder whether guilt had already begun to settle inside her. If it had, she hid it well. By noon, the venue had filled with family, friends, coworkers, and neighbors. Conversations drifted across the ocean terrace while a string quartet played softly near the ceremony space. I spotted my father speaking with several guests. He looked unusually serious. Not unhappy, just distant. I assumed he was overwhelmed. Parents often are during weddings. I thought nothing of it. A wedding coordinator approached me. 5 minutes, Claire. I nodded. Everything suddenly became real. This was it. The day Ethan and I had spent more than a year planning. The day our families officially became one. I took one last deep breath before stepping toward the ceremony entrance. Then someone called my name. Claire. It was my father. He rarely sounded uncertain. This time he did. Can we speak privately? I smiled. Of course. We stepped into a quiet hallway overlooking the gardens. He closed the door behind us. For several seconds he said nothing. I waited patiently. Finally, he folded his hands behind his back. I've made a mistake. I frowned. What do you mean? I've been thinking about this for weeks. My heartbeat slowed. Something wasn't right. Dad. He looked directly into my eyes. I don't believe you and Ethan should get married. I stared at him, convinced I had misunderstood. What? You heard me. I forced out a nervous laugh. This isn't funny. I wasn't trying to be funny. The hallway suddenly felt smaller. What happened? Nothing happened. Then why are you saying this now? Because it's the last chance to stop something that shouldn't happen. Every instinct inside me searched for a reasonable explanation. Had Ethan been hurt? Was someone sick? Had there been an accident? Instead, my father calmly delivered words that would echo inside my mind for years. Ethan would be happier with Natalie. Silence. Absolute silence. I actually looked behind him, expecting someone to jump out and announce it was some cruel misunderstanding. No one came. I whispered the only words I could find. Dad, what are you talking about? They're better suited. They understand each other. They have stronger personalities. You've always been too reserved. Each sentence landed harder than the last. You can't possibly mean this. I do. You're asking me to cancel my wedding? I think it's the right decision. No, he shook his head slowly. I'm asking Ethan to marry Natalie instead. The world stopped. I don't remember breathing. I don't remember blinking. Only the overwhelming silence after those words. Before I could respond, footsteps echoed behind us. The hallway door opened. Ethan walked inside. Then Natalie. Neither of them looked surprised to see my father there. Neither asked what was happening. Instead, they exchanged a glance that lasted only a second. It was enough. Something inside me shattered with terrifying clarity. This conversation had not begun 5 minutes ago. I was the last person invited into it. I looked from Ethan to Natalie, searching desperately for someone to deny what I was beginning to understand. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them moved toward me. In that unbearable silence, I realized the greatest betrayal wasn't that my father had chosen someone else for my fiancé. It was that everyone standing in that hallway had already made the decision long before I ever walked through the door. There are moments when crying becomes impossible. People imagine heartbreak as tears, screaming, or collapsing onto the floor. For me, it was silence. I looked from Ethan to Natalie, then back to my father, waiting for someone to laugh and admit this had gone far enough. No one did. Instead, Ethan finally spoke. His voice was barely above a whisper. Claire, I'm sorry. That single sentence confirmed everything. Not confusion. Not pressure. A decision. You knew, I said quietly. He lowered his eyes. Yes. How long? He hesitated. Several weeks. Several weeks. For weeks, I had been tasting wedding cakes while they planned a different future. For weeks, Natalie had zipped up my wedding dress during fittings while keeping their secret. For weeks, my father had smiled through family dinners knowing he intended to destroy the happiest day of my life. I turned toward Natalie. She couldn't meet my eyes. I'm sorry, she whispered. You don't get to use those words. Her shoulders trembled. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I almost laughed. What exactly was supposed to happen? Neither of them answered. My father stepped forward. Claire, emotions are high right now. I stared at him in disbelief. Emotions? I've simply recognized what everyone else was too afraid to admit. You and Ethan aren't right for each other. Ethan and Natalie have a stronger connection. They'll build a better life together. Every sentence sounded rehearsed, as though he'd convinced himself this wasn't betrayal. It was wisdom. I suddenly realized something that hurt almost as much as losing Ethan. My father genuinely believed he was doing the right thing. He wasn't apologizing. He expected me to understand. Outside the hallway, music continued drifting through the venue. Guests laughed. Champagne glasses clinked together. Somewhere nearby, the officiant was probably wondering why the ceremony hadn't begun. Life was continuing only a few feet away while mine quietly came apart. What happens now? I asked. Richard answered without hesitation. We explain everything. To 140 guests? If necessary. You want me to stand in front of everyone and tell them my father decided another bride would be a better fit? This isn't about appearances. His words almost made me smile. It never is, I replied. It's always about what you want. For the first time that afternoon, my father looked irritated. You've always been stubborn. No. I shook my head slowly. I've always been obedient. That difference finally mattered. The room fell silent again. Ethan took one cautious step toward me. I never wanted to hurt you. Then why did you? His mouth opened. Nothing came out. Because there was no answer capable of making sense of what he'd done. I reached into my handbag and removed the engagement ring. The diamond caught the afternoon sunlight for one brief second. I looked at it, then at him. When I placed it into his hand, it felt surprisingly light. I won't make this harder for either of us. His eyes widened. Claire, no. My voice remained calm. You already made your choice. Natalie began crying openly. I never wanted to lose you. I looked at the woman who had once been my closest friend. You lost me before today. You just didn't know it. Neither of them tried to stop me. Perhaps they knew they no longer had the right. Perhaps they never had. I opened the hallway door and stepped back toward the reception area. The string quartet was still playing. Guests smiled as they saw me approaching. Some assumed the ceremony was about to begin. They had no idea it had already ended. The wedding coordinator hurried toward me. Claire, everyone's ready. I nodded politely. I know. Without raising my voice, I walked to the center of the gathering. More than 100 conversations gradually faded into silence. Every face turned toward me. Friends, family, co-workers, people who had traveled across the country to celebrate a marriage that would never happen. I didn't tell them every detail. Some betrayals are too personal to perform before an audience. Instead, I smiled as steadily as I could. I'm so sorry, I said. There won't be a wedding today. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Questions followed immediately. I answered none of them. I thanked every guest for coming. I apologized for their wasted trip. Then I turned around and walked away. No dramatic speech. No accusations. No scene. Just one woman leaving behind the life she had spent years building. I climbed into my car with nothing except my purse, my phone, and the wedding dress I never had the chance to wear. As I drove away from the ocean, I never once looked into the rearview mirror. Because somewhere between that hallway and the parking lot, Claire Morgan, the woman who spent her entire life chasing other people's approval, had quietly disappeared. The woman driving toward an uncertain future no longer intended to ask anyone for permission to build a new life. People assumed I disappeared because I was heartbroken. The truth was simpler. I disappeared because I finally understood that staying would only allow everyone else to keep defining who I was. 3 days after the canceled wedding, I resigned from my job in Boston. Not because I had stopped loving architecture. Because every street corner carried a memory I no longer wanted to relive. The coffee shop where Ethan and I had planned our future. The bridal boutique where Natalie had laughed while helping me choose a dress she already knew I would never wear. The neighborhood where my father lived. Every familiar place felt like a museum dedicated to a version of Claire Morgan that no longer existed. So I packed my apartment into a moving truck. 2 suitcases. A few boxes of books. My drafting tools. My laptop. Everything else could be replaced. Peace could not. I accepted a position at a mid-sized architectural firm in Chicago. The salary was lower than what I had left behind. The projects were smaller. No one there knew my story. That anonymity became my greatest gift. On my first morning, my new manager, Daniel Foster, walked me through the office. We're not the biggest firm, he said with an apologetic smile, but we build things that last. I smiled politely. That's enough for me. He had no idea those words meant far more than architecture. I rented a small apartment overlooking the Chicago River. The furniture didn't match. The walls were nearly empty. Some evenings I ate dinner sitting on the floor because I hadn't bought a dining table yet. Oddly enough, I had never felt safer. No unexpected visitors. No family expectations. No endless attempts to earn someone's approval. Only silence. And for the first time in years, silence felt comforting instead of lonely. People often believe healing begins with dramatic breakthroughs. Mine began with ordinary routines. Morning coffee, running before work, long evenings reviewing blueprints, weekend visits to museums. learning the names of streets in a city that owed me nothing and expected nothing from me. Months passed before I realized I had gone an entire day without thinking about Ethan. Then an entire week. Eventually, even my father's face stopped appearing in every quiet moment. One afternoon, nearly a year after leaving Boston, Daniel stopped beside my desk. "Have you ever considered leading projects instead of just designing them?" I looked up. I assumed I wasn't experienced enough. He laughed. "I've been watching your work. You solve problems before anyone else notices they exist. That's harder to teach than drafting." That promotion changed everything. For the first time, people recognized me for my ability instead of comparing me to someone else's expectations. I worked harder than ever, not to prove my father wrong, to prove to myself that my future belonged entirely to me. Over the next several years, promotions came steadily. Large commercial projects, historic renovations, luxury residential developments. Each success opened another door. By the time I turned 34, I left the firm to establish Morgan Studio, my own architectural practice. Friends questioned the decision. "It's risky. The market is competitive. What if it fails?" I answered every concern the same way. "I've already survived losing everything that mattered. Starting a business doesn't scare me." The first year was exhausting. There were weeks when I handled design meetings during the day and accounting late into the night. Some clients rejected proposals. Others delayed payments. There were moments when I wondered whether everyone had been right. Then one project led to another. A boutique hotel, a waterfront residential community, a restoration contract for a century-old theater. Reputation grows quietly. One satisfied client introduces another. One successful project becomes 10. Before long, Morgan Studio employed more than 40 architects, engineers, and designers. The company carried my family name. But unlike the life I had left behind, this one had been built entirely on choices I made for myself. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday morning nearly 8 years after I had driven away from my wedding venue, my assistant walked into my office holding a visitor request. "They say they're family." I looked at the names on the screen. Richard Morgan, Ethan Brooks. For a long moment, I simply stared at them. The life they had chosen had finally brought them back to the woman they once believed was too quiet, too ordinary, and too easy to leave behind. When I finally opened the front gate, I noticed something immediately. No one tried to hug me. 8 years earlier, my father would have walked into any room believing he belonged there. Now he waited until I nodded before taking a single step onto my property. Power changes people. Sometimes because they gain it. Sometimes because they lose it. Richard looked older than 70 should. His gray hair had thinned considerably, and the expensive tailored suits he once wore had been replaced by a plain navy jacket that hung loosely from his shoulders. Ethan had changed too. The confidence that once made him attractive had disappeared. He avoided looking directly at me, studying the stone pathway as though every crack demanded his attention. I invited them into the sunroom overlooking the gardens. It was bright, quiet, and intentionally simple. No family photographs. No personal keepsakes. Only clean architecture and large windows opening toward the lake beyond. My assistant placed coffee on the table before leaving us alone. No one touched their cups. Finally, I broke the silence. "You asked to see me." My father nodded slowly. "We weren't sure you'd agree." I almost didn't. He accepted that without complaint. I suppose we deserved that. That was new. The man who had never admitted mistakes was choosing his words carefully. "What do you want?" He looked at Ethan before answering. "We owe you the truth." I folded my hands in my lap. "I've had 8 years. I stopped waiting for explanations a long time ago." Ethan finally raised his eyes. "You still deserve one." His voice sounded smaller than I remembered. I thought Natalie understood me better. I convinced myself that excitement meant compatibility. I believed passion mattered more than loyalty. He laughed bitterly. I was wrong. I listened without interrupting. Not because I agreed. Because none of his regrets could change history. "What happened?" I asked. He looked toward the garden. For a while, everything looked perfect. He and Natalie married less than 6 months after my canceled wedding. Friends who had attended both ceremonies told me later that it had felt strangely forced. At the time, I hadn't cared enough to ask questions. Now he answered them anyway. We argued constantly. The qualities I admired became the things we fought about. We couldn't trust each other. I remained silent. He continued. "If someone is willing to betray another person for you." He stopped himself. then finished quietly. Eventually you wonder when they'll betray you too. The room fell silent again. That sentence required no response. My father cleared his throat. I encouraged that marriage. Yes. I believed I was protecting everyone. You believed you knew my life better than I did. His shoulders lowered. Yes. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he surprised me. I underestimated you. I almost smiled. No. You underestimated loyalty. His eyes filled with something I had never seen before. Shame. I did. He looked around my home. I've heard about your company. It's doing well. It is. You built all this yourself? Yes. I never imagined. I interrupted gently. I know. He nodded once. I always thought you needed someone stronger beside you. I looked directly at him. That was your mistake. I never needed someone louder. I needed people who kept their promises. No one argued. Outside, wind moved softly through the trees surrounding the property. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It simply existed. Eventually, I asked the question that had been waiting since they arrived. Where's Natalie? Neither man answered immediately. Instead, they exchanged another brief glance. It reminded me of the hallway 8 years earlier. Except this time, there were no secrets left worth protecting. Ethan exhaled slowly. We divorced 3 years ago. I wasn't surprised. Not because I wished them unhappiness. Because relationships built on betrayal rarely escape the foundation they begin with. And now? I asked. He looked directly into my eyes for the first time that afternoon. Now I've spent years realizing I destroyed the only relationship that was ever honest. His words hung quietly between us. Years ago, hearing that confession would have shattered my heart all over again. Today, it stirred nothing except distant recognition. The woman who had once dreamed of hearing him regret his choice no longer existed. Only then did I realize why they had truly come. It wasn't simply to apologize. It was because life had finally taught them the lesson they refused to learn when I tried to love them with honesty, patience, and unwavering loyalty. There is a strange misconception about forgiveness. People think it begins with the words, "I forgive you." It doesn't. It begins when you no longer feel responsible for fixing the people who broke you. My father leaned forward slightly, his hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had long since gone cold. I know I don't deserve another chance. No, I answered honestly. You don't. Neither he nor Ethan reacted. Perhaps they had expected anger. Instead, they were met with something far more difficult. Acceptance. Not acceptance of what they had done. Acceptance that the past could never be rewritten. Richard took a slow breath. I've replayed that day thousands of times. I know exactly where I was standing. I remember every word I said. He closed his eyes for a brief moment. If I could change one decision in my life. You can't, I interrupted gently. His eyes opened again. I know. That simple answer carried more weight than any dramatic apology could have. For years, I had imagined confronting him, demanding explanations, asking why I had never been enough. Standing across from him now, I realized I no longer needed those answers. Because they belonged to a younger version of me. The woman sitting here had already built a life without them. Ethan cleared his throat. There was something else. I looked toward him. My marriage didn't just fail. It destroyed almost everything. He explained that after the divorce, several mutual friends had quietly drifted away. Business partners no longer trusted him. His reputation suffered. People rarely said it aloud, but everyone remembered how his relationship with Natalie had begun. I spent years trying to convince people I'd changed. He smiled bitterly. The hardest part wasn't convincing them. It was convincing myself. I believed him. Not because I thought suffering erased guilt. Because regret sounded different from excuses. And he was no longer making excuses. What do you do now? I asked. I teach. The answer surprised me. At a community college. Business management. He laughed softly. I spend most of my classes talking about integrity. For the first time that afternoon, I almost smiled. Life has an unusual sense of irony. The man who once abandoned honesty had made it the center of his career. Perhaps that was its own quiet punishment. My father reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. I brought something. He placed a small envelope on the table. I don't want your money, I said immediately. It's not money. I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a single photograph. It had been taken the day I graduated from architecture school. I was wearing my cap and gown, smiling beside my father. I remembered that day clearly. After the ceremony, He'd congratulated me with a firm handshake instead of a hug. At the time, I'd convinced myself that was simply who he was. On the back of the photograph, written in handwriting I immediately recognized, were a few simple words. I was proud of you. I just never knew how to say it. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Not because the note erased 8 years of pain, because it revealed something almost tragic. My father had loved me, in his own limited, deeply flawed way. He simply loved control more. He mistook directing my life for protecting it. By the time he understood the difference, I was already gone. I should have said those words when they mattered, he whispered. Yes, I know. Silence settled over us again. Gentle, unforced. Outside, the afternoon light stretched across the gardens. Employees crossed the courtyard carrying project folders, completely unaware that one of the most important conversations of my life was unfolding only a few feet away. Finally, I stood. Both men instinctively rose with me. I appreciate that you came. Neither of them spoke. I believe you're sorry. Ethan's shoulders relaxed slightly. My father looked hopeful for the first time since arriving. Then I continued. But believing your apology and rebuilding my life around you are two completely different things. Hope quietly disappeared from both of their faces. Not because I had been cruel, because they finally understood something they had never understood 8 years earlier. Forgiveness is not the same as restoration. Some doors close without hatred. They simply close because peace deserves stronger locks than love ever required. I picked up the photograph and slipped it carefully back into the envelope. It would remain a memory, not an invitation. And as I walked toward the front door to see them out, I realized the greatest victory of my life had never been building a successful company. It had been becoming a woman who could look the people who broke her heart in the eyes and still choose herself. After I walked them to the front door, none of us reached for a handshake. Some goodbyes don't need ceremony. They simply need honesty. Richard paused on the front steps. I won't ask to come back. I nodded. Thank you. I just wanted you to know that if you ever needed me. I smiled gently. That's the difference between us now. He looked confused. I don't need you anymore. There was no cruelty in my voice. Only truth. He accepted it with a slow nod, as though he had expected those words for years. Ethan stood quietly beside him. I hope someday you'll think of me without anger. I considered the question carefully. I already do. His eyes lifted. I don't think about you with anger. I think about you with gratitude. That answer surprised both of them. Ethan frowned. Gratitude. If you had married me that day, I probably would have spent years trying to become the woman you wanted. I would have mistaken compromise for love. I would have kept asking whether I was enough. I looked around the home I had built. The life I have now exists because you left. I would never choose to relive that pain. But I can't deny what it taught me. For a long moment, no one spoke. Sometimes the truth is impossible to argue with because it asks for nothing in return. My father quietly placed one hand on the gate before leaving. I'm proud of you, Claire. The words arrived 8 years late. Even so, they no longer carried the weight they once would have. I smiled. I know. It was the first time in my life that I didn't need him to repeat them. They walked slowly toward the waiting car. Neither looked back. Neither needed to. As the gates closed behind them, I expected to feel relief. Instead, I felt something quieter. Completion. Not because justice had punished them. Life had already done that. Not because they had apologized. Apologies cannot return lost years. It was because I no longer carried the invisible burden of hoping they would finally understand me. They understood now. And somehow, that no longer mattered. The following Monday, life resumed exactly as it always had. Client meetings filled the morning. Design reviews occupied the afternoon. My team debated materials for a waterfront cultural center, while construction managers called from 3 different job sites. Nothing about my schedule changed because 2 people from my past had briefly stepped back into it. That realization made me smile. Years ago, they had been the center of my world. Now they occupied less than an afternoon on my calendar. Near lunchtime, Daniel called. Although he had become a partner in Morgan's studio years earlier, he still enjoyed checking on major projects himself. I heard your visitors finally left. News traveled quickly inside the company. They did. You okay? I looked out the office window toward the skyline. I'm better than okay. He laughed. I figured. You've looked strangely peaceful all morning. I am. After hanging up, I opened the envelope containing the graduation photograph once more. For several minutes, I studied the younger woman smiling beside her father. She looked hopeful, eager, certain that love could always be earned through hard work. I wanted to reach into that photograph and tell her something. Not to warn her about Ethan, not to expose Natalie, not even to stop her father. Because if she escaped that heartbreak, she might never discover who she was capable of becoming. Instead, I silently thanked her for surviving, for refusing to become bitter, for driving away from that wedding without knowing where the road would lead. Late that afternoon, I walked through the studio as employees prepared to leave for the evening. Young architects argued enthusiastically over sketches. Interns carried scale models between conference rooms. Someone laughed loudly from the break room. The building felt alive. Every person there had been hired because of talent, not favoritism, not family, not obligation, merit. It was the kind of place I had needed when I was 28. So I built it for others. As I switched off the lights in my office, I glanced once more at the photograph resting inside my desk drawer. I didn't throw it away. I didn't display it either. Some memories deserve to be preserved. They simply don't deserve to become the foundation of your future. I closed the drawer, locked my office, and stepped into the evening knowing that the greatest revenge had never been proving my father wrong. It had been building a life so full of purpose, dignity, and peace that the people who once walked away could never again become the center of my story. A year after my father and Ethan visited, I received a handwritten letter. Not an email, not a text message, a letter. The envelope carried my father's familiar handwriting. For several minutes, it rested unopened on my kitchen counter while I made tea. There was no urgency anymore. That alone reminded me how much my life had changed. Years ago, anything connected to him would have controlled my entire day. Now it simply waited until I was ready. Inside was a single page. Claire, I don't know how many years I have left, but I wanted to spend at least one of them telling the truth. I spent your childhood believing that love meant preparing you for disappointment. I praised independence more than tenderness. I mistook criticism for guidance. When I chose Ethan and Natalie, I believed I was protecting everyone from a marriage I imagined would fail. Instead, I became the reason my daughter's heart broke. I cannot ask you to forgive me again. You already gave me something greater than forgiveness. You gave me the chance to tell the truth before it was too late. Live the rest of your life without looking back for me. Love, Dad. I folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the graduation photograph inside the same drawer. 2 reminders, not of betrayal, of growth. Several months later, I learned through a mutual family friend that Richard had passed away peacefully in his sleep. I attended the funeral quietly. I sat near the back of the chapel. No one expected me to speak. No one asked me to. After the service, I stood beside his grave for only a few minutes. The wind carried the scent of fresh rain across the cemetery. I hope you found your peace, I whispered. It was enough. I walked away before the crowd began gathering around the family. Some endings don't require an audience. Life continued, just as it always had. Morgan's studio expanded into 2 additional cities. We launched scholarship programs for architecture students whose financial circumstances reminded me of my own early career. Every year, I personally interviewed the finalists. Not to choose the smartest applicants. To find the ones who quietly believed they weren't enough. Because I recognized that look immediately. One afternoon, a young woman stayed behind after her interview. I don't think I belong here, she admitted. Everyone else seems more confident. I smiled because I remembered saying almost the exact same thing years before. Confidence usually arrives after you've already done the difficult thing. It rarely comes before. She smiled through nervous eyes. Months later, she became one of our strongest interns. Watching people discover their own strength became one of the greatest joys of my career. Not because I wanted them to become successful, because I wanted them to stop asking permission to believe in themselves. Sometimes, journalists asked about my personal life during interviews. They wanted dramatic stories, scandals, regrets. I always answered the same way. The most important decision I ever made wasn't building a company. It was refusing to let someone else's opinion become the blueprint for my life. That quote eventually appeared in magazines, business podcasts, and graduation speeches. People assumed I was talking about entrepreneurship. Only I knew it had begun in a hallway outside a wedding ceremony that never happened. Every now and then, I still drove past the ocean where that venue overlooked the water. The building had changed owners. The gardens looked different. New couples laughed where I had once stood in silence. I wished every one of them happiness. Not because love always lasts, because honest love deserves the chance. As I approached my 40th birthday, I realized something that would have been impossible for the younger Claire to imagine. I no longer measured my life by what had been taken from me. I measured it by everything I had chosen afterward. The betrayal that once defined my story had become only its opening chapter. The rest had been written by resilience, quiet determination, meaningful work, loyal friendships, and a peace no one could ever take away again. If someone asks whether I forgave my father, Ethan, or Natalie, my answer is simple. Forgiveness was never the destination. Freedom was. And freedom arrived the day I stopped waiting for the people who broke my heart to become the people who healed it. In the end, they didn't give me my future. I built it myself. One careful choice at a time. One honest promise at a time. One peaceful day after another. And that has always been the happiest ending I could have written for myself. People often ask whether there was ever a moment when I knew I had completely healed. They expect a dramatic answer. A perfect speech. A life-changing realization. The truth is much quieter than that. It happened on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. Morgan Studio had just completed the largest project in our company's history, a public library overlooking Lake Michigan. As guests wandered through the finished building during the opening ceremony, I stepped away from the crowd and stood beside a wall of glass facing the water. Children ran through the reading garden. Parents laughed together on the benches. Students filled notebooks while sitting beneath trees we had fought to preserve during construction. The building was doing exactly what architecture should do. It wasn't showing off. It was serving people. A reporter approached me. "Ms. Morgan." I turned with a polite smile. "I've read about your story. I almost didn't come," she admitted. "I thought today would be another interview about business." She hesitated. "But everyone keeps saying your company feels different. What makes it different?" I looked around before answering. "We build buildings. But more importantly, we build environments where people feel respected." She nodded slowly. "I meant your employees. They all speak about you with enormous loyalty." I smiled. "Loyalty isn't something you demand. It's something you earn." As soon as the words left my mouth, I realized they summarized my entire life. Not only as a business owner, as a daughter, as a partner, as a friend. For years, I believed love required endless sacrifice. Now I understood something far healthier. Real love never asks you to abandon your dignity in order to keep it. That evening, after the ceremony ended, I returned home as the sun disappeared beyond the lake. The house was quiet, exactly the way I liked it. I placed my keys on the kitchen counter and opened the drawer where I still kept two things. My graduation photograph. My father's final letter. Time had softened the paper at the edges. Not the memories. The memories no longer needed softening. They had already settled into their proper place. They were part of my history, not my identity. I gently closed the drawer again. Nothing inside it needed to be carried anymore. Later that night, I stepped onto the terrace with a cup of tea. The city lights reflected across the water, each one shimmering independently. I thought about the young woman who had driven away from a wedding 8 years earlier with no plan except to survive. She believed she had lost everything. She couldn't possibly have imagined that the road ahead would lead here. To peace. To purpose. To freedom. If I could speak to her now, I wouldn't tell her to stop crying. I wouldn't tell her everything would be fine. Instead, I would simply say this. Keep driving. Don't turn around. The people who fail to see your worth are not qualified to decide your future. One day, you'll wake up in a home built by your own hands. You'll be surrounded by people who choose honesty over convenience. You'll laugh without wondering whether happiness will be taken away. And when the past finally knocks on your door, you'll discover something remarkable. You won't need revenge. You won't need validation. You won't even need an apology. Because by then, your life will have grown so much larger than your pain that the people who once broke your heart will occupy only a few quiet pages in a story filled with thousands of better ones. That is the strange beauty of healing. It doesn't erase the past. It simply refuses to let the past become the ending. I closed my eyes for a moment and listened to the wind moving gently across the lake. There was nothing left to prove, nothing left to win, only another peaceful tomorrow waiting to be built. And for the first time in my life, that was more than enough. Years have a quiet way of revealing what truly lasts. Success changes. Cities grow. Buildings age. Even grief becomes gentler with time. Character is what remains. 15 years after the wedding that never happened, I stood once again inside an architecture school. This time, I wasn't graduating. I had been invited to deliver the commencement address. As I waited behind the stage curtain, I watched hundreds of young graduates adjusting their caps, laughing with classmates, searching the audience for familiar faces. Some waved excitedly to proud parents. Others stood alone. I noticed them because I had once been one of them. Not physically alone. Emotionally. The dean introduced me with a generous list of achievements. Founder, architect, mentor, philanthropist. The applause was warm as I stepped toward the podium. For a moment, I simply looked across the room. I didn't see future architects. I saw people standing at the beginning of lives they could not yet imagine. When I graduated, I believed my career would be defined by the buildings I created. A few students nodded. I was wrong. The most important thing I ever built wasn't made of steel or concrete. It was self-respect. The room became completely silent. There will be people who underestimate you. Some will do it because they don't know you. Others will do it because knowing your potential makes them uncomfortable. You cannot spend your life trying to earn permission from people who have already decided not to see your worth. I paused. The moment you stop asking for that permission, your real life begins. When the ceremony ended, dozens of graduates approached to shake my hand. Some asked about internships. Others wanted career advice. One young woman waited until everyone else had left. My family doesn't think I should become an architect, she admitted quietly. They say I'll fail. Her words carried no anger, only exhaustion. I recognized it immediately. What do you think? I asked. She hesitated. I think they're wrong. I smiled. Then don't spend 20 years trying to convince them. Spend those years proving yourself to yourself. Tears filled her eyes. Thank you. As she walked away, I realized something. Many people believe encouragement changes lives. Sometimes it does. But often, what changes a life is hearing someone confirm the truth you already carry inside yourself. Later that afternoon, I drove back to the office. Morgan's studio had grown beyond anything I once considered possible. New partners now managed offices across the country. Many of them had started as interns. Some had come from difficult families. Others had overcome failures they once believed would define them forever. None of us had perfect stories, but every one of us had chosen to keep writing after the hardest chapter. Before leaving for the evening, I walked through the studio one last time. The lights glowed softly above drafting tables. Half-finished models filled the design room. Blueprints covered conference tables where tomorrow's meetings would begin. The building felt alive, not because of its architecture, because of its people. I remembered the frightened woman who had once driven away from a canceled wedding believing her future had disappeared. If she could see this place now, she would probably cry. Not because she had become successful, because she would finally understand that losing the wrong people had created space for the right life. As I locked the office door behind me, I caught my reflection in the glass. Older, calmer, stronger. Not because life had become easier, because I had stopped allowing pain to introduce me. I introduced myself now, on my own terms. And if there was one lesson my journey had given me, it was this. The people who reject you may influence one chapter. They never have the authority to write the ending. That privilege has always belonged to you. Not every legacy is measured in money. Some are measured in the lives that become possible because someone chose compassion instead of resentment. 20 years had passed since the morning I drove away from a wedding that never happened. If someone had told the 28-year-old version of me that one day I would feel grateful for that heartbreak, I would have thought they were cruel. Now I understood they would simply have been seeing farther down the road than I could. One autumn morning, I visited the newest project funded by the Morgan Foundation. It wasn't a skyscraper. It wasn't an award-winning museum. It was a vocational training center built for young adults leaving foster care. Many arrived with no family to guide them. No inheritance. No safety net. Only hope. As I walked through the classrooms, I watched students studying engineering, architecture, construction management, and design. Some smiled nervously when they recognized me. Others remained focused on their work. Exactly as they should. The building wasn't about me. It belonged to them. The director greeted me near the entrance. "We have someone who wants to meet you." A young woman stepped forward carrying a portfolio. "I don't know if you remember me." I looked carefully before recognition slowly appeared. She had once been the nervous graduate who believed she didn't belong in architecture school. Now she stood before me wearing a project manager's badge. I wanted to thank you. You probably don't remember what you told me. I remember. I smiled. Don't spend 20 years trying to convince them. She laughed. I've repeated those words to myself almost every week. She opened her portfolio. Inside were photographs of affordable housing developments she had helped design across several states. Families are living in these homes now. I thought you should know. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I realized something beautiful. Kindness has an extraordinary habit of traveling farther than we ever see. One conversation becomes one decision. One decision becomes one career. One career becomes thousands of lives quietly improved. Perhaps that is how healing multiplies. Not by forgetting pain, by transforming it into something useful. Before leaving, I walked alone through the courtyard. Children from a nearby community center were drawing buildings with colored pencils at outdoor tables. One little girl proudly held up her picture. I made this. It looks wonderful, I said. She grinned. I'm going to build houses when I grow up. I think you will. She ran back to her friends without another word. Children don't ask whether they deserve their dreams. They simply believe in them. Somewhere along the journey to adulthood, many of us forget how to do the same. Driving home, I found myself thinking about Natalie for the first time in months. Not with anger, not even with curiosity, only with distance. I hoped she had found peace as well. Holding on to resentment would have dishonored everything I had learned. People are responsible for their choices. But I no longer wished anyone a life defined by their worst decision. I wanted something better than that. For them. For myself. When I arrived home, the evening sun filled every room with warm light. The house had changed over the years. New artwork covered the walls. Shelves overflowed with books collected from travels around the world. Photographs of friends, colleagues, scholarship recipients, and completed projects filled frames throughout the living room. One thing was missing. There were no reminders of the life I had almost lived. Only reminders of the life I had intentionally created. I poured myself a cup of tea and stood beside the window overlooking the garden. The trees moved gently in the autumn breeze. Everything felt remarkably ordinary. And perhaps that was the greatest blessing of all. Peace rarely arrives with applause. It settles quietly into ordinary mornings, meaningful work, loyal friendships, honest conversations, and evenings where your heart no longer searches for what it has already found. Looking across the garden, I finally understood that my story had never been about betrayal. Betrayal was only the spark. The real story had always been about becoming the kind of woman who could lose almost everything and still build a life so full of grace that even the deepest wound became the foundation of someone else's hope. If there is one thing I have learned after all these years, it is that life rarely gives us the ending we imagined. Sometimes it gives us something far better. When I was 28, I believed my future depended on one wedding, one family, one man's promise. I thought losing them meant losing the life I was meant to have. I couldn't have been more wrong. The life that was waiting for me did not begin because everything went according to plan. It began because everything fell apart. Every morning now begins the same way. I wake before sunrise. I make coffee. I open the windows overlooking the garden. The birds arrive before the city fully wakes. The air carries that familiar quiet that has become one of my favorite sounds. Years ago, silence reminded me of loneliness. Now it reminds me of peace. Sometimes my nieces and nephews from friends' families visit the house. They race through the garden without worrying about expensive flowers. They laugh too loudly. They leave fingerprints on the windows. They remind me that a home is meant to be lived in, not admired from a distance. Occasionally, they ask how I became an architect. I always tell them the truth. I kept building. Not just buildings. Confidence. Courage. Hope. One decision after another. None of them know the entire story yet. One day they might. If they do, I hope they never remember the betrayal more clearly than the lesson that followed it. Every year, on the anniversary of the wedding that never happened, I do something very simple. I take the day off. Not to mourn. To celebrate. I visit somewhere new. A small town. A museum. A quiet beach. A hiking trail. Anywhere that reminds me how much larger the world is than a single painful memory. That date no longer belongs to heartbreak. It belongs to freedom. People sometimes imagine that strength means never breaking. I know differently. Strength is allowing your heart to break and choosing to remain kind anyway. It is refusing to become the very thing that hurt you. It is believing that disappointment is an event, not an identity. Looking back now, I don't hate my father. I don't hate Ethan. I don't hate Natalie. Hatred asks us to keep carrying people who have already left. I set that weight down a long time ago. What remains instead is gratitude. Not for what they did, but for the woman I discovered after surviving it. She is calmer than I ever expected, more compassionate than I thought possible, more confident than the frightened bride who once stood in a wedding dress wondering why she wasn't enough. The answer had never been that I wasn't enough. The answer was that I had been standing in front of people who could not recognize what they had. That realization changed everything. If my story ever reaches someone sitting alone after being betrayed, someone questioning their worth because another person walked away, I hope they remember this. Do not measure your future by the people who failed to appreciate you. Measure it by the person you choose to become after they leave. Your greatest chapter has no obligation to begin with perfect circumstances. Sometimes it begins with a closed door, a long drive, a quiet goodbye, and one small decision to keep moving forward. As for me, I no longer think of my life as the story of a canceled wedding. I think of it as the story of a woman who finally learned that love should never require the abandonment of self-respect. Everything beautiful that followed grew from that single truth. I once believed my father chose someone else over me. Today I understand something much more important. His choice shaped his life. Mine shaped my future. And every peaceful sunrise I have witnessed since then has been a gentle reminder that the happiest endings are not given to us by the people who stay. They are built, day by day, by the person who refuses to stop believing that a better life is still waiting just beyond the next horizon. That person, in the end, was me.